This Sicha is a Sicha that the Rebbe is explaining a piece of Igeres HaTsheuva of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, along with the Rebbe's father, Reb Levi Yitzchak's Ha'aris, his notes on Igeres HaTsheuva. So the Rebbe starts off the Sicha and says that after the Alter Rebbe explains the details regarding the various different fasts of Tshuva, this is what he does in the second and third chapter of Igeres HaTsheuva. He then says in the beginning of chapter 4, that all of this is just to be able to complete the kapara, the atonement, in the best possible way after doing tshuva. That means, earlier on in Igeres HaTsheuva, in the first chapter, the Alter Rebbe says that tshuva is the person deciding that he's no longer going to do this aveira anymore. Then in the second and third chapters, he spoke about legmara kapara, to have a full atonement. There's a concept of fasting. And then the Alter Rebbe says, so all of this is for the full atonement after the tshuva, but the idea of tshuva itself, and the Alter Rebbe says like this, hascholas mitzvahs HaTsheuva ve'ikra, in order to really be able to appreciate the actual mitzvah of tshuva itself, the main idea of tshuva, the Alter Rebbe says, ha'hechrech levayir heitiv, we must explain well, ba'archavas habir, with elaborating and giving a full explanation, Behekdim mashakasu b'Zoyar HaKadosh, by first prefacing what it says in the Holy Zoyar, in regards to the explanation of the word tshuva according to Kabbalah. And there it says that the word tshuva can be made up of two parts, tashuv, hey, that the hey returns. Now within this itself, there are two levels of tshuva. There are two heys in the word tshuva also. So, Tashuv Hey, if we speak about the second Hey of Hashem's name, which is called the lower Hey, Kei Tata'a, so Tashuv Hey would then be read as Tshuva Tata'a, would mean the Tashuv Hey Tata'a. This is the return of the lower, the second Hey of Hashem's name, to its rightful place. Then there is Tshuva Ilah. Tshuva Ilah could be understood as Tashuv Hey, the higher Hey of Hashem's name, returning to its rightful place. Now, in his notes on Tanya, the Rebbe's father's notes on Tanya, in the second Ha'ara on Igeres HaTsheuva, so the Rebbe's father explains these words, Levayir Heitev Barchavas Habir, and he says that this is actually hinting to something very specific, these words. He says like this, the words Levayir Heitev and Barchavas Habir correspond to these two levels of tshuva that we just mentioned, the lower level of tshuva and the higher level of tshuva. How so? So he says that Levayir Heitev refers to the lower level of tshuva, tshuva tata. He says the word ba'er, or perhaps here it can maybe even be understood as be'er. So this is a remez to the level of malchus, which in the letters of Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, malchus is that lower hay. Levayir Heitev, so the word Heitev is a remez for Yesoid Zah, for the sphere of Yesoid, out of the 6 midos that precede Malchus. Here it doesn't go so much into it, but the Rebbe's father actually says that we know that generally the sphere of Yesoid is often referred to as Toiv, so this would be the Vav of Hashem's name. And since in Tshuva Tata itself there are two levels, because there's the Tshuva itself, which is more connected with Malchus, which is the Hey. And there's tshuva, and then there's a Baal tshuva. So if we speak about tshuva tata, the Baal tshuva tata, this is the Yesoid, this is the level of Yesoid, this is the level of Vav. Yesoid is often considered like the Baal, the husband of Malchus, or Baal tshuva is the master, or the husband of Malchus, and therefore this is the sphere of Yesoid. So Levayir Heitev is Yesoid and Malchus, or Yesoid really generally the first 6 spheros, which is the Vav of Hashem's name. And this is why the Alter Rebbe uses this particular expression, Levayir Heitev, which shows on this last Hey of Hashem's name along with the Vav, to hint to these two aspects within the Tshuva Tata'a. Then the Alter Rebbe says, Ba'archavas Habir, says the Rebbe's father, this corresponds to the Tshuva Ilah, to the first Hey of Hashem's name. Because the first Hey of Hashem's name generally corresponds to the level of Bina, And when we say harchavas habir, to elaborate about something in an expansive way, this is really what Bina is all about. Again, as the Rebbe's father explains this in his Ha'ara. The Rebbe says we need to understand. In Tshuva Ilah, there are also two levels, or two details, like we said in Tshuva Tata. There's the Tshuva itself, and Baal Tshuva, just like we said in regards to Tshuva Tata. In Tshuva Tata, we said that this is the Hey and the Vav that precedes it. In Tshuva Ilah, you also have the same idea, that the higher level of Tshuva is Bina, the first Hey of Hashem's name, and the Baal Tshuva Ilah is the level of Chachma, the Yud. The Alter Rebbe says this clearly in Likutei Torah, as pointed out in the footnotes over here. So the question then is, why is it that for the Rembes of Tshuva Tata, the Alter Rebbe uses an expression that would hint to both ideas? As we said, that the words Leva'ir Heitev refer to Malchus and to the Yesod, to the spheres that come before Malchus. So we have the Tshuva itself, which is Malchus, and Baal Tshuva, of the lower level of Tshuva, is the level of Yesod. Whereas for the Remez, for Tshuva Ilah, the Alter Rebbe uses the term B'harchavas Habir, but the way that Rebbe's father just explained it, that refers to Tshuva Ilah, but just in the level of Bina, so it's only the level of Tshuva, but there's no hint for the Baal Tshuva Ilah, which in the Spheros would have been the Sphere of Chachma, or the Yud of Hashem's name. The Rebbe says we also need to understand the words Levair Heitev B'harchavas Habir, we need to explain well, with a detailed explanation, the Alter Rebbe says. The next words the Alter Rebbe says is what it says in the Holy Zohar regarding the word of tshuva, etc. So simply, the way we understand it is Levair Heitev, we want to explain what says in the Zohar. But when it says that we want to explain Be'archavas Habir, and then it says Behekdim Mashakasu B'Zohar HaKadosh, we want to explain something in detail, and then it says, by prefacing what says in the Zohar, it sounds like there are two separate things, where we want to explain something very well, and by explaining what says in the Zohar, we're going to be explaining something. It's not we're going to explain what says in the Zohar. It sounds like we're going to explain something else, not what it says in the Zohar. And by explaining the Zohar, this is going to help us understand something. So we need to understand how this works. What is it that the Alter Rebbe is trying to explain? In addition to these diyukim, what's also not understood, says the Rebbe, is the general idea, what the Alter Rebbe says, that in order to understand the beginning of mitzvah HaTsheuva and the main point of tshuva, we first need to explain. As we said, by Heitev, when introducing a Zohar about the idea of tshuva according to Kabbalah, so the Rebbe says, seemingly, the way we're going to explain tshuva according to Kabbalah, that tshuva means that the hay needs to return to its rightful place. That is only explaining what is accomplished through tshuva. That when a person did an Aveira, he caused that the lower hay of Hashem's name, which refers to the level of the Shechina, caused it to go down into Golus. When you do a proper tshuva, you're returning that hay back from its place in Golus, back to its rightful place. So we might be explaining what was achieved by doing tshuva. But seemingly, in the actual performance of the mitzvah of tshuva itself that the person needs to do, you would think there's nothing being added by explaining the idea of tshuva according to Kabbalah. The Alter Rebbe says we want to explain what tshuva is based on what it says in Zohar. Seemingly, we're not explaining anything more by explaining this Zohar more than what the Alter Rebbe said originally, that the main thing of tshuva is that you're not going to sin anymore. You're deciding that you're abandoning the sin and you're not going to sin anymore. How is it helping in my tshuva? Because I know, al pi Kabbalah, what happens as a result of the tshuva. From the fact that the Alter Rebbe says Hascholas mitzvahs HaTsheuva ve'ikra, the beginning of mitzvah of tshuva, and the main point of tshuva, ha'hechrich levar, we must explain the idea of tshuva according to Kabbalah. It sounds like that by giving this explanation of tshuva according to Kabbalah, this is going to be necessary for the actual performance of the mitzvah of tshuva, what the person has to do. And furthermore, it's not only necessary for tshuva, but to use the Alter Rebbe's words, it's necessary for the beginning of the mitzvah of tshuva and for the main aspect of tshuva. How so? The Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe says that the question becomes even much stronger. The Alter Rebbe says from the Zohar HaKadosh, not only about the word tshuva according to Kabbalah is toshuv hay, that the hay needs to return to its rightful place, But as we said, there are two hays. There are two levels of tshuva. There's tshuva tata and tshuva ilah. So now it sounds like that in order to start doing tshuva, we need to also understand all about tshuva ilah, about this highest level of tshuva. And the question is, the difference between the two levels of tshuva, the lower level of tshuva and the higher level of tshuva. The Alter Rebbe tells us later in Igeres HaTsheuva that tshuva tata is where a yid is returning to his previous state as he was before he sinned. The Alter Rebbe says we need to wash ourselves, we need to cleanse ourselves from these soiled garments of the Aveira. What is tshuva ilah, which comes after tshuva tata? This is a much higher level, where the neshama is returning back to its source, becoming completely united with Hashem, in the same extent as the neshama was before it ever even came down from Hashem into the body. Hashem blew the neshama into the body. So tshuva ilah means that the neshama is becoming so united with Hashem as if he is before he even entered the body. So the question is, how could we say that we spoke about fasts earlier on? Alter Rebbe says regarding the fasts, which are only there to help cleanse the nefesh and to finish off the kapara, so that he should be precious to Hashem and accepted to Hashem like before he sinned. Those things, the Alter Rebbe says, that's after tshuva. That's not part of the mitzvah of tshuva. The mitzvah of tshuva itself is just abandoning sin. All these fasts, those are almost like an extra thing after the sin. So those things are not important for tshuva. And yet here we're saying that the idea of tshuva ilah, which is seemingly much greater than anything we spoke about before, this idea of the neshama returning to its source as it was before Hashem even put it into the body. This is something that could apply not even necessarily to someone that sinned. It could be even someone that never even sinned in his life, has this level of tshuva ilah, just uniting with Hashem. And this high level should be important for the basic level of tshuva to correct the sin. And furthermore, we say this is the beginning of tshuva, this is the main part of tshuva. How do we make sense of this? In order to understand all of this, says the Rebbe, so the Rebbe is first going to focus on the general idea of tshuva tata and tshuva ilah. And the Rebbe says that it's explained in a number of places that tshuva tata is connected with the idea of sur meirav asay tov, staying away from bad and doing good, doing mitzvahs. Tshuva ilah is more connected with our involvement of Torah, learning Torah. As the Alter Rebbe brings later in Igeres HaTsheuva from the Raya Mehemne in Parshas Nosoi, that tshuva ilah is the yisasik boiraisa, that the person should involve himself with learning Torah. How do we understand this? Why is this tshuva tata? This is tshuva ilah. So the Rebbe says, in the avodah of kiyum mitzvahs, when a person is performing mitzvahs, the main thing that's expressed is the person's bittul in a way of kabbalas oil malchus shamayim. He's accepting upon himself that Hashem is the boss, that Hashem is the king. He's ready to listen, to obey whatever Hashem tells him, even if it's difficult. Like a servant, like a slave that's going to obey his master, not taking anything else into consideration. On the other hand, the bittul that is brought about when a yid is learning Torah. So when a yid is learning Torah, we say that the word of Hashem, the halacha that he's learning, it's like the words of Hashem are coming right now through the person's mouth, through the person's throat. In other words, it's not about him at all. He's just being a channel for Hashem's words. That's why we say man malke, who's considered like the king. The chachamim, rabbanon, are considered like the king because they have such tremendous bittul to the Eibishter when they're learning Torah. Not like a servant that's doing something for the king and for his master, but it's as if he himself is the master right now. He himself is the king. It's Hashem's words, the Torah coming through his mouth. Says the Rebbe, this idea, this sort of bittul, when a yid is learning Torah, where does this come from? This is all coming because where is the neshama before it came into the body? Before Hashem blew the neshama into the body, the neshama before it came into the person, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, this is going to be connected to the Eibishter in the greatest way, with the greatest bittul. The neshama of a person usually, even of a tzaddik gomer, the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, doesn't have the greatest level of bittul to be mamish one with Hashem. However, when we learn Torah, this is coming from that level of the neshama that's as if the neshama before it even came into the body, when it was mamish one with Hashem. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why we say that tshuva tata is more to do with fulfillment of mitzvahs, staying away from bad and doing good. Tshuva ilah is more to do with learning Torah, because the bittul of the yid that comes as far as the neshama once it came into the body, after Hashem blew it into the body, especially after it comes, in other words, after it left Hashem, and even more so once it comes into Olam Hazeh and coming into a physical body. So that is that a person is a separate Metzius, a separate entity, and he is bottled to Hashem. He's standing with a bittul like the servant to the king, etc. Now, since the idea of tshuva tatah is mainly about a yid going back to his previous state as he was before he sinned, to cleanse himself, to wash himself from those soiled garments, etc. But even before he sinned, he was still a Metzius, he's still an entity for himself. So therefore, that's what tshuva tatah is. He's going back to being the way he was before. So tshuva tatah, therefore, is mainly connected to this idea of mitzvahs, fulfillment of mitzvahs, which is, he's a separate entity, he's a servant, and he is doing what the king said. That's all tshuva tatah. On the other end, tshuva ilah, which is the neshama returning to its source, as it was one with Hashem before Hashem even ever put it into the body, as it was one with Hashem before Hashem, so to speak, blew it out of himself. That's why this level of tshuva is connected with the involvement of learning Torah, which, as we said before, what's Torah? Torah is just the words of Hashem coming through the person's mouth, without the involvement of the person almost. It's like a channel completely for Hashem. So these are two general levels. Again, to summarize, in the first level, the lower level of tshuva, the person is very much still a mitzias and is going to be more connected with mitzvahs. In the higher level of tshuva, it's Torah, and the person is a non-existence at all. Now the Rebbe says that really in each one of these two, we can break it further down into two. These two levels of tshuva, tshuva tatah and tshuva ilah, each one of these could really be found within each one of these tshuvos. That means within each level of these tshuva, we can break it down to two levels. And that's going to be what we called before, the tshuva and the baal tshuva that exists in tshuva tatah. So the lower level is going to be called tshuva within tshuva tatah. And then the baal tshuva is going to be the one that's even higher than that. And similarly in tshuva ilah. What does this mean? So regarding these two levels of tshuva tatah, which we said, sur meira v'asei toiv, so Chassidus explains that the lower level of these two in tshuva tatah, within tshuva tatah itself, is the idea of sur meira, where a person is making sure that he shouldn't be in a way that he can ever go against the will of Hashem. This is sur meira. He's ensuring that he's not going to go against Hashem's will. The higher level of tshuva tatah, which we are calling now baal tshuva, this is more related to v'asei toiv. That means he really puts in all of his toil, all of his effort in his avodah, whether it's Torah or tefillah. But the point is that he's going beyond his nature, beyond what he's used to. This is what the Alter Rebbe refers to elsewhere in Tanya as the Oved Elokim, the one who really serves Hashem. Like the Gemara explains the difference between a person that learns 100 times or 101 times. He's going out of his habit, he's going out of his comfort zone. The Rebbe says, now let's look at these two levels and we'll understand why these two levels, one that we're calling now tshuva and one we're calling baal tshuva within the tshuva tatah itself, why we're going to say that one is more similar to tshuva tatah and one more similar to tshuva ilah. Again, we're speaking about tshuva tatah, but within tshuva tatah, we're saying that there's two levels within that can also be one similar to tshuva tatah, where the person is a metzias, and tshuva ilah, where the person is completely one with Hashem. In the avodah of sur meira, the person that's doing the avodah is still very much of a metzias. It's only that because he's bekabel oil malchus shamayim, so in other words, that's stopping him from going against Hashem's desire. And that's why this is very much the idea of tshuva tatah. Within the tshuva tatah, this is the lower level, because he's still very much a metzias, and he has to make this decision to accept upon himself Hashem that I'm not going to go against Hashem's desire. Whereas in the avodah of v'asei toiv, which we said that he's really working hard in his avodah, in Torah, tefillah, etc., much more than his habit, much more when he's used to. He's breaking his nature. So this is about, to a certain degree, within tshuva tatah itself, but with a certain degree, he's going out of his mitzvahs. He's breaking himself. And that's why this is more similar or more related, like to the idea of tshuva ilah, and we're calling it the baal tshuva. Nevertheless, even this higher level is still part of tshuva tatah. It's only that within tshuva tatah itself, it's the higher aspect of it. And it's where it's comparing it to tshuva ilah for two reasons. In other words, there's two reasons why it's still part of tshuva tatah, why it's still the lower level of tshuva. Because number one, even as he's doing the v'asei toiv, he still didn't go out of his nature completely. It's only that practically he's overcoming himself, overcoming his nature through a struggle, through a fight. So there's still some of his nature left. And furthermore, even the fact that he's breaking his nature is still different to by Torah. We said that the words of Torah are just flowing through the person's mouth. It's Hashem's words coming through his mouth. In this case, we're still saying it's the person's avodah. The person is breaking himself. The person is working now and doing this avodah for Hashem. So now, so far we discussed the two levels within Tshuva Tata, one where the person is more of a Metzias, one the person is less of a Metzias, but still somewhat of a Metzias. Now we look in the next level, in Tshuva Ilah. So generally we said this is the idea of learning Torah. But the Rebbe says even in the involvement of learning Torah, which we said is connected to Tshuva Ilah, this is still not the ultimate level yet within Tshuva Ilah. We said there's Tshuva and there's Baal Tshuva. So this level of learning Torah we would call the Tshuva level. What's the Baal Tshuva level? What's higher than that even? So the Rebbe says this is the avodah of Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha. This is the idea when a person says that even things that are permitted, I'm going to abstain from, I'm going to stay away from. The Rebbe says that based on what we said before, that Tshuva and Baal Tshuva are similar. Within Tshuva Tata itself, we said there's like Tshuva Ilah and Tshuva Ilah. Within the Tshuva Tata itself, there's these two levels. So in a similar way over here now, regarding Tshuva Ilah, we would say that the learning of Torah is more like the Tshuva Tata, or the lower aspect within the Tshuva Ilah, and Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha would be the higher level of those two. How so? So the Rebbe brings what says in the Mechilta. On the Pasuk, V'heyisem li Sgula, Hashem says, you're going to be my treasure from all other nations, etc. So that the Mechilta says, on the words V'heyisem li, Shetiyu Knuyin li, you're going to be completely acquired to me or by me, V'oisken b'Torah, involved in Torah, and you won't be involved in anything else. So there's 2 points over here, learning Torah and not involved in anything else. So the Rebbe says, so Oisken b'Torah is still not enough that you're completely konui, completely acquired to Hashem. There also needs to be this condition that you're not involved in anything else, which is this avoid of Kadesh Atzmacha, sanctifying ourselves, even in the things that are permissible and necessities of the world, etc. That means, when a person is learning Torah, even if he's learning Torah in a way that is the word of Hashem coming out of his mouth, it's still no proof that his whole Metzias is completely, konui, acquired by Hashem. That he's completely, absolutely bottled. Because it's still possible to say that the bittul that he has when learning Torah, it's only that the Torah was so powerful and so great, it permeated him completely, that he's losing himself, his own entity completely. But it still doesn't mean that a person on his own, from his own, is standing with this complete bittul to Hashem. Where is the avoid of Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha, where the person himself is sanctifying himself, removing himself from his own personal things, which, as the Mechilta says, the Dvorim Achedim, you're staying away from other things, even though they're permissible things. This really brings out that he's completely removing himself, mevatel himself, just to have absolute bittul to Hashem, that he has no Metzias at all. His whole Metzias is konu, is acquired to Hashem. So the Rebbe says now we can understand that the real inyan of Tshuva Ilah is specifically expressed in this idea of Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha, as opposed to the bittul of the learning of Torah is still considered within the realm of Tshuva Ilah, but like the lower level. In other words, because Tshuva Ilah is this absolute amazing unity that a neshama yid has with Hashem, as it was, we said before the neshama even came out of Hashem. When neshama is, before it came out of Hashem, you can't say that it has any metzias whatsoever. So since we just explained that the bittul by learning Torah is not completely negating the person's own metzias, that's why it's still the lower level within Tshuva Ilah. Whereas the avodah of Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha, which really brings out that the person's whole metzias is just completely Hashem's. Therefore, this is the higher level and the ultimate level of Tshuva Ilah. Says the Rebbe, now we could also understand why this avodah of Kadesh Atzmucha B'muter Lecha is connected with the Yud of Hashem's name, the level of Chachma. As we said earlier, that the Tshuva Ilah, the Hey would be Tshuva Ilah, and the Yud would be the Baal Tshuva Ilah. Because what's the idea of this Yud? The Yud is something that It's just a little dot, like without a shape and form. It's specifically this avoid of Kaddish Atzmacha B'mutar Lecha. That's where it's really being brought out, that essential bond of the Yid with the Eibishter, like a Yud which goes higher than any shape or form. The Iskashrus of a Yid with Hashem in the three avodos of Sur Meirah, Asay Toiv, and involvement in Torah has still some sort of shape and form. In other words, since in them there is still this idea that the person didn't leave his own Metzias completely, absolutely. So therefore the avodah right now is he has his Metzias and he's trying to connect it to Hashem. And therefore the Iskashrus is still also shaped and formed according to the person's own faculties with which he is achieving this Iskashrus. And that's why we say that these three categories of avodah are connected to the letters Hey, Vav, and Hey of Hashem's name, which all of them have a certain shape and form. Whereas this avodah of Kaddish Atzmacha B'mutar Lecha, which is about the person removing himself completely, himself and his rotzin, etc., etc., and it brings out the etzem nekudas ha'искashrus, the deepest point of iskashrus, which is higher than any shape and form of any of his faculties. That's why this is hinted in the Yud, which is like a little tiny dot. Says the Rebbe, just like we understand in regards to the four oisius of Shem Havaya, it all starts with a little dot, that little nekuda, the ois Yud. Then this Yud is drawn down and it comes into the shape, is drawn down into the first Hey of Hashem's name. Then it goes further down into the Vav, till finally coming down to the last Hey of Hashem's name. Says the Rebbe, the same thing is true in Avodah, in these different Avodas that we spoke about, that they're not four distinct and separate Avodos, but rather they're a continuation, a flow, one from the other. It all starts off with that essential bond, point of connection of a Yid with Hashem, which is higher than any shape or form. And the way it's expressed is really by the person completely negating himself and his Metzias, which is expressed in Kaddish Atzmacha B'mutar Lecha, as we explained. But then this point of Iskashrus then comes down into his avodah of learning Torah, and then into V'asei Toiv, and then finally into Sur Meirah. And based on this, we can understand that if the person is lacking in the last level, in the lowest level, that he's missing the basic Kabbalah's oil Malchus Shamayim, in the avodah of staying away from an Aveira, what is this impacting? It's not only impacting the lowest letter of Hashem's name, that lowest Hey, but it's also impacting the first three letters. Because if he would really have inside of himself shining this Nekuda of Bittul, the Yud of Hashem's name, or at least the learning of Torah, which is the first Hey, or the V'asei Toiv, which is the Vav, so then he would definitely have the Bittul of the Kabbalah soul, staying away from Aveiros. If he's lacking in that last point, that means there's something missing all the way to the beginning. And this is the reason why we say that when a Yid, Chas v'Shalom, falls and he does an Aveira, what does he need? He needs even this idea of Tshuva Ilah, because only then will his tshuva be perfect. What is tshuva ilah? As we said, he needs to have this idea of that real point of iskashrus on the highest level with Hashem. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, not only is it in order for the tshuva to be perfect, you also need tshuva ilah. That means you'll have tshuva tata, and then you will have tshuva ilah. But rather, within the tshuva tata, within the lower tshuva level of tshuva itself, it has to be in a way that it's felt, at least as far as practically concerned, what you're going to be doing, you have to feel to some extent the idea of tshuva ilah. What does this mean? So we said, the Alter Rebbe said right in the beginning of Igeres HaTsheuva that the main thing has to be, is the basics of tshuva, is that you're deciding you're not going to be acting in a foolish way anymore to rebel against Hashem. You're not going to go against the mitzvahs of the king, Chas v'Shalom. But within that itself, you need to feel not only this general bittul of Kabbalah soil as a servant that's ready to do whatever the master says, even though I'm not the master and I'm something else and I'm removed, etc. But rather, this bittul itself, he has to feel that it's as a result that because, why am I doing this? Because my neshama in its source is really connected absolutely to the Eibishter. So even in his basic level of tshuva, there has to be the feeling that he's doing this all because on the highest level he's really one with Hashem. So the Rebbe says, now we can understand an explanation in Avodah for something that the Alter Rebbe says. With Alter Rebbe, when he's speaking about tshuva tata, and we say it's the idea of the lower hay returning, but the Alter Rebbe doesn't only say it's the lower hay returning from its state in Golus. It says it's returning to unite with the Yud Kei Vav with the first three letters. What does that mean? Because the idea of the lower hay of Hashem's name on its own in avoidus of the avoid of the person, that would be this bittul of Kabbalah Soil Malchus Shamayim, as the neshama is inside the guf. So Toshav Kei Tata, that this lower hay returns to be united with the Yud Kei Vav, means that this bittul of Kabbalah Soil, this lower hay of Hashem's name, should be in a way that in it is felt the connection, that he's really one, that his neshama is really absolutely one with Hashem. That's the idea, that the lower hay is really connected to the previous letters all the way to the Yud Kei Vav of Hashem's name. Now the Rebbe comes back to answer some of the questions of the Sicha earlier. Based on this, says the Rebbe, we can now understand how by explaining the word tshuva according to Kabbalah, the Toshuv Hay, is going to help us in understanding of the mitzvah of tshuva itself, meaning it's going to help in what the person has to do. How so? Because by explaining by Richus Habir, with a whole explanation, how this lower hay is not something for itself, but rather, as we just explained, it's a continuation from the other three letters, and that the idea of tshuva is about this lower hay of Hashem's name going back to its rightful place, as it is connected to those previous letters of Hashem's name. We now have a whole new perspective on the mitzvah of tshuva in the idea of, yes, I do need to decide that I'm not going to act the way I was acting till now, to rebel against Hashem, chas v'shalom. But what does this mean? That despite the fact that the main idea of Kabbalah Soil is mainly, the idea of this tshuva is that I'm going to stop myself from doing bad, not to rebel against Hashem, etc. It's keitata, but at the same time it needs to be connected to the avoidus, as we said, of the other three oisius of Shem Havaya. And that's what the Alter Rebbe says, that it's important to first mention hascholas mitzvahs HaTsheuva v'ikar right in the beginning of tshuva, right in the main part of tshuva. I already need to be speaking about the tshuva ilah, because tshuva in the simple sense has to be in a way that in it is felt even this highest level of tshuva ilah. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand when the Alter Rebbe says these words, levair heitev bar chavas habir. And we said that this corresponds to the two levels of tshuva, as we said before, the kei tata, and Toshav Kei Tata, that the lower hay is returning, and Toshav Kei Ilah, that the higher hay is returning, as we brought before from the Rebbe's father. So it's not only a remez, it's not only that these words the Alter Rebbe is saying is a nice remez to these two concepts of tshuva, but rather there's a whole explanation, there's a whole chiddush over here of how there needs to be the hascholas mitzvahs HaTsheuva v'ikra, how we need to start off tshuva. And this is what the Alter Rebbe means when he says levair heitev bar chavas habiyur, and then he says behekdim mashakasu b'zoyer HaKadosh. So what's the Alter Rebbe about to do? Levair heitev bar chavas habiyur means the Alter Rebbe is telling us that we're not only going to explain what it says in the Zohar, as we would have thought originally. The Alter Rebbe says, no, we're about levair heitev bar chavas habiyur is a concept for itself. We're going to understand something very important now based on what says in the Zohar. But it's not that we're coming to that we're going to understand this based on the Zohar. Again, levair heitev bar chavas habiyur is a statement for itself. In other words, in order for the beginning of mitzvah of tshuva should be in the proper way, with the full heart, etc., what you need to have, number one, is this idea of levair heitev bar chavas habiyur. This is the statement. We're later going to explain what this means based on the Zohar. But in other words, what does this mean? That despite the fact that tshuva mainly is sheyigmar b'leiv, that you decided in your heart that you're not going to rebel against Hashem, and you're not going to be over on the mitzvahs of Hashem, the idea of sur meira, which is generally the lower hay of Hashem's name, nevertheless, within that you also need to feel levair heitev bar chavas habiyur. You need to feel the vav of Hashem's name. The levair has to be heitev. In other words, that in the Kabbalah, in this acceptance that you're not going against the Malchus of Hashem, you have to also feel, at least on some level, at least concealed, that you're also ready to do the next avodah, which we said is the Vav, which is you're toiling and you're going more than your nature, similar to the idea of Asay Toiv. Furthermore, within this Kabbalah itself that you're accepting that you're not going to go against Hashem, it has to also be Bar Chavas Habiyur, which, as we said, corresponds to the higher hay of Hashem's name, which is the idea of Bina. That means within your acceptance, you also have to feel at some level that you're ready to be mevatel yourself completely to go out of your mitzias, similar to the idea what happens in the learning of Torah. But one second, what happened to the fourth level? What happened to the level of the Yud, the Chachma? So the Rebbe says, now we can understand the reason why there's only a remes for these three levels of tshuva, and the Alter Rebbe is not meramis to the higher level of tshuva, the Baal tshuva ilah, which is the level of the Yud. Says the Rebbe, because regarding the Ois Yud, we don't need to have a special avodah that it should be felt in that acceptance where the person is saying, I'm accepting upon myself not to rebel against the Malchus of the Eibishter. Why? Because this idea of the Ois Yud is that Nekudas HaEskashos, that's the essential bond, that's not even connected, as we said before, to any shape or form. So it's understood, it's obvious that this Nekuda is felt immediately in every single avodah that's going to be in any of the other three Oisias, in any of the other three letters. Because, as we said before, each one of those three letters are just coming as a continuation from that Nekuda coming down into a shape and form. In fact, says the Rebbe, on the contrary, it's dafka because this Kabbalah, not to be moirid malchusi yizborich, is really an idea of bittul, which on the one hand is lower than the other avodas, it's lower than tzir. But dafka in it, it really feels over here, dafka in this bittul is really felt that nekudas ha'iskashos, that essential bond that's really higher than any shape and form. Says the Rebbe, and since with these words, levair heitiv bar chavas habir, the Alter Rebbe is coming to Mechadish what you need to do in your tshuva b'poil. Therefore, he says a lashon that only hints to the three dargos, but not to that fourth most essential level.